In this video, you'll learn all the settings that make your plugins work. The settings in the back of your effect plugins can be a little bit overwhelming, but today we're going to simplify that, as well as drop-down options and other related options you might be wondering about. Please like and subscribe, and let's get started. So I have Waves CLA 76 open here. We'll start with the drop-down. We have Replace, where we can replace this with any other effect. Delete, we'll of course delete and get rid of this effect out of our effects chain. Then we have our presets section where we can choose a preset. We also have a presets option over here. That'll do the same exact thing. We have our browse presets option, which is going to open this section over here in our browser. We will have a folder for each and every effect, at least each and every effect that has a preset saved in here. And all we have to do is open it, drag it, and drop it into an effects slot, and then voila. If we wanted to add this over here, we could save preset as, and boom. You just saw this drop down a little bit. That is because we just added a folder over here where I'm going to save our preset to. It dropped down because the folder is above at, oh, it is not. Here it is. Fruity Wrapper CLA 76 preset. I thought it would have been just CLA, but the externals evidently get little options here. So now if I wanted to bring this with the same settings in, I could drag and drop a preset. But generally, we're just going to work in our plugins preset browser or in this preset browser right here. You'll also notice that the preset we saved over here is also now an option down here. Now we also have a add to plugin database or flag as favorite option. And in order to use that, we actually have to go to our plugin database. We have to choose a folder that we think would best represent this preset. So for me, it'd be Dynamics. And then we'd click this button and it would add this into this folder over here, which I'll click cancel because I don't want that. And that folder is actually going to be this. See Dynamics, we got Bittersweet, C6, blah, 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 Bittersweet, C6, blah, blah, blah. And side note, if you want to organize and edit these, right click here, open, here's all your folders, create a name, whatever you want, move everything around to where you want it. And that's how you get this. Back to the plugin, we've got display preset name and preset selector. And what this will actually do is it's supposed to display the preset right here. So if I changed it to piano, now says piano, rock my piano, says rock my piano. If I turn that off, it just says presets. We also have store and spare state, which is a great way for A/Bing. So if I moved our attack and our release all the way to this side, I could store and spare state, move it all the way the other way, and then I can flip with spare state and flip it again, and it'll A/B and go back between both of them. If you want to do this quickly, click the drop down, click F, and it'll go a little bit quicker for you. Next, we have link all parameters. And so this is going to do like a multi-link situation. Like if we were to click multi-link to controllers, boom, and it's got 154 different controls that it wants me to hook to. So I won't do that, but pretty cool option. We also have browse parameters, and it'll open the folder for this specific instance, and it'll give us all of these different options for us to link to. And it looks like really it's only using these first ones here. If I change it, you'll see it highlight over there, which is actually really cool. My ratio. And this is a good way to explore options and plugins, because some plugins you can't link to specific knobs or certain knobs. So cool thing to play around with. Now we've got allow threaded processing. Threaded processing is when it takes one of your CPU cores and breaks it up into a bunch of virtual cores to allow for faster processing and more tasks being handled at once. This will mess up some plugins. So if you're having issues, you can try turning that off and see what happens. Smart Disable is an option to save CPU, which will actually stop a plugin from using up any CPU when it's not in use. When it does become in use again, it'll re-engage. Having Smart Disable on with Melodyne, for example, will create timing problems. So you can switch this on or off here, depending on what you need. If you want to do it quickly for all plugins, we can go Tools, Macros, and switch Smart Disable for all plugins. And then if you have something that's negatively impacted, just come back in, turn it off. Now, we have Make Editor Thumbnail, which is actually pretty cool. It'll take whatever settings you have here and just this whole image, and it'll make it the thumbnail in your browser. Now, we have Rename and Color, which is just like everywhere else. You can rename it. You can click this little drop down. You got these different options to choose. And if I come back in here, we've got these different symbols. As you can see, it turned into that symbol. Let's reset it. Color over here on the right-hand side. You have different ways to select the colors. If you come through here, you can randomize it, type it in, or if you want to default it to what it originally was, click the D for default. And of course, we can type in a name. Change color and change icon are the same options we just dealt with in there. Detached allows it to go outside of FL Studio and outside the window. This is an option you can choose if you want to move it to a second window, for example. However, doing this can actually make it so your plugin can steal priority from the sound driver or for Midi, which can have a negative impact in your working space. If you don't want it to be able to steal priority, options, audio settings, make sure auto close is off. When auto close is off, FL Studio will take priority for the audio driver and it will keep it. To the right, we have a little cogwheel, which will show these options here. So if you don't see them, you can click that. Before we go to the wrapper settings, we'll go over here. So this option here allows the plugin to take keystrokes before the host does. It says it in the top left. And what this means is that the plugin's going to handle stuff that I click on my keyboard before the host. So if I have hotkeys within this plugin, I can use the hotkeys on that plugin. And then only the leftover unrecognized information will then be sent to FL Studio. So this is extremely helpful in plugins like SliceX, where if I'm playing the keyboard, it's going to be notes, but then also some hotkeys. See, all of a sudden I'm renaming something for no reason. So if I turn this off, then I don't have to worry about it picking up hotkeys that I don't want it to. I can just do the MIDI straight from my keyboard. Now, our VST wrapper here that this video is about, and this section here, is only for non-native plugins. If I open up an FL whatever or a Fruity whatever, you're going to notice we don't get that option. Okay, all we're going to have is our mute, which is here, and our mix level, which is also there. Something to note about the mix level is it's going to be interesting for some plugin. EQs cause phase. As soon as you start changing this mix, you're going to get phasing issues unless you're using linear, but whole nother topic, amongst other things. So this is really cool. But if you ever find a mix knob that's actually within your plugin, prefer that. Now, starting here, top left and across, we've got info. So we got the type of plugin, 64-bit, the name, and latency. Here we'll see none. We have a drop-down where we can set some, but FL Studio does a dang good job of taking care of this for us. If I open J37, which is more intensive, we'll see I have 2.1 milliseconds of latency coming from this plugin, which is already being compensated for. To the right here, we'll have options, and we have save, delete, reset, etc. What this is going to do is this is going to save our settings or our options in here so that every single time we reload this plugin, it's going to have those same options. So we can see if I start, no, it's whatever. You can see as I start clicking stuff here, if I click reset, it's going to reset to the default. Scale editor dimensions, you'll notice that that didn't change. And now the reason for that is that this isn't actually going to save everything. Some graphics user interface options and some of the other options actually won't save this way. In order to save that, you're actually going to want to come over here and we'd add to plugin database as a favorite. Now, if autosave is on, you won't have to worry about saving for the options that do save. You flip it on or off, it'll stay that way. We can reset, delete, or save the current state, which is helpful if autosave isn't on. Our bit size, you're probably going to want to leave to native, but if you notice that the 32-bit or the 64-bit version of the plugin is just more stable within FL Studio, then you can opt to choose to make sure to open that version of the plugin. We go here to the left, we have the reload plugin option where it'll just kind of reopen the plugin and reset everything to what it was. We also have refresh plugin properties, which will update our latency and all of this information here, which can be helpful if things just didn't read right or open right, or you're having latency issues. That might solve it by getting FL Studio to register that latency and compensate for it automatically. We have our save or load preset bank here, which as you'll see is just kind of like our regular presets. Load allows you to load a standard VST or bank, an FXP or FXB file, I believe. I don't have much experience with them, nor do I actually know much about the way it functions because I don't use it, but that's what that's for. And saving allows us to save in the FXP format. Save all lets you save all the banks as individual presets. Again, I don't really use this, so I'm not sure how that works practically. That's just what I've gotten from the FL Studio user manual. We have our Midi input port and output port, which correlates to the Midi port of our controllers. So if I set this to 1, it'll take all the key information from port 1, which is by Akai, which can be great for using vocoding type effects. If you're running some vocals through a mixer channel and you hook that up, you can actually set some MIDI or play some notes to work with that. If you wanted, you can actually add MIDI out. This will open in a channel here. You can go piano roll and put whatever you want in the piano roll for the MIDI out. Change this to whatever port 6, for example. And then if this is a vocoder for something that's pre-recorded, you can change and experiment with the different notes at the different times in the song using our MIDI out, which is pretty cool. We have send pitch bend range. So this is for like pitch bend wheels and stuff like that. If your effect plugin actually allows that, and that actually works in the plugin, you can turn this on. It defaults off, however, because some plugins don't like pitch bend and it can actually mess with them. Pitch bend information and your standard CC information operate a bit differently. And so really you only got to turn this on if you need it. And then if you turn it on, that should be one of those options that auto saves that you won't have to worry about again. So we've got send note release value, which again is MIDI related. If your controller has a release value built into it, it'll read that and send it to the plugin. We have send mod X as polyphonic aftertouch. So the aftertouch, you've seen those cool MIDI controllers where you can like click the keys, and after you're clicking the keys, you hold it, you can like wiggle your fingers and it'll change it and do whatever else. If there's anything in the plugin that is affected by that, you can turn this on to actually use your mod X settings in the piano roll to affect that. They didn't have it in the MIDI out, but here we go. We got modulation X. This, however, actually would affect the mod X in here, I'm assuming. Now, even though I used the controller aftertouch concept and idea for explaining that, this option is related to just the piano roll and mod X specifically, and is not related to aftertouch actually from a MIDI controller. Now, moving to graphics user interface, there's some options here that are missing. So I have opened an instance of Contact where we now have all of these graphics user interface options. So check properties on display change. So some plugins send what's called display change messages when some properties have changed. And this option allows FL Studio to receive this display change information to make sure that things are synced correctly between FL Studio and the plugin. We have invalidate editor. And just like there's display change messages, there's also idle messages. And this allows the plugin to send the idle message to FL Studio, allowing FL Studio to refresh it or refresh the GUI, the graphics user interface. If your plugin is having glitchy interface issues, then you can try uncheck this and see if that fixes the issue. Next, we have update when hidden, which is going to continue to update the graphics user interface when it's not visible. This, of course, is going to take more processing, so this doesn't need to be on. If you're having issues with your graphics updating, then you could try and turn that on and see if it helps. We have accept dropped files. That's exactly like it sounds. If I was to take Windows files and try and drop them into the plugin, it can either accept or not accept them. A lot of plugins you can open standalone, and they're going to have areas where you can drop files to, and this will get those to operate as if it's opened standalone rather than in FL Studio. So we have keep focus. This will prevent the plugin from stealing keyboard input. So if you're having an issue with a plugin stealing keyboard input when you're trying to use the keyboard for something within FL Studio, you can turn that on. This does not always work, however. When a plugin is bridged and you have it open, it will always steal keyboard focus. And we'll talk more about things bridged later on in the processing section. So next we have DPI aware when bridged, or dots per inch. And dots per inch is like kind of like a calibration setting, which is why it affects the scale of your plugin or VST, because DPI, there's a certain amount of dots per inch within the view on your PC. I don't know how else to describe it. And so if you have a plugin that is too big or too small, if this is on, that can help fix it. If you are bridging a plugin to fix this or fix scaling issues, you want to make sure that the DPI is off, because the DPI is going to try to scale or calibrate this to whatever FL Studio is telling it. And in order for you to get a plugin to open the correct way when we bridge, which again we'll talk about in the processing page, you want to make sure FL Studio is not trying to calibrate or tell it what size it needs to be, because most likely FL Studio is the reason it's not scaled properly in the first place, at least when you're having scaling issues. So we have scale editor dimensions. And this is something that you can try if the wrapper window is not the same size as the plugin itself. This can be seen when the plugin wrapper is too small and it's cutting off some of the plugin, or it's too big, which if I turn this on, there we go. It's too big, something like this, where the plugin's not fitting the entire thing. So sometimes be too big, too small. Click this, see what happens. Next, we have automation, notify about parameter changes. So if there's something that automatically changes within a plugin, like my voice denoiser here, I got this terrible noise coming in from driving my preamp so hard for this dynamic microphone that's like 3 feet away from me. And in order to manage this, all these different points are moving. Well, in the back of my plugin here, I've got notify about parameter changes. The issue with this is if I was to record automation, yep, and we come here, This is all automation that got drawn in by my stinking voice denoiser. You don't always want the automation that's coming in from your plugins to get recorded because it can mess things up. So with that being said, this is something I'd want off. If we go to processing here, we have allow threaded processing. Threaded processing is going to be when you take one core and you turn it into multiple cores, or virtual cores, I should say. You take a solid core, turn it into virtual cores, which allows for quicker processing. This, however, can have negative impacts on a plugin. So if you notice some kind of CPU or performance or glitchy issue, try turning this off back here to see if that helps. If you want this advantage, even if it's on here, it might not be on in your audio settings. So you'd want to go to multi-thread generator, which would be for instruments or multi-thread mixer processing. We have allow smart disable, which just like the threaded processing we talked about before with this smart disable button here. And the dropdown, we have a global smart disable in our audio settings. That needs to be on in order to turn on the smart disable in here or allow the smart disable in here, which allowing the smart disable in here has to be on to actually engage smart disable for it to work on our plugin. Now, that might seem like a lot of extra unnecessary things. However, the cool thing about this is some plugins, the smart disable messes with them. So if we turn this off and we save that, that should save the allow smart disable as off, which will keep us from negatively impacting our plugin if we use our macro tool to switch smart disable on for all the plugins. And we would do this if there's just a lot of CPU stress when there doesn't need to be. So changing it there can save you from having extra steps every single time that you want to, use smart disable. Next option, make bridged. Make bridged is going to take your plugin and open it as a standalone plugin, pretty much. So it's going to make it like it's a Windows process. So if I was to open my little bar here, I've got OBS recording all of this. OBS is a standalone Windows program. Contact 5 is a plugin in an FL Studio. If I click Make Bridged, though, it is no longer a plugin in an FL Studio. It is now considered a standalone plugin or a standalone program, at least according to FL Studio. I clicked Make Bridged. You don't see it down here, but FL Studio is going to treat it like it's its own Windows program. If we turn off the DPI aware and we make it so it doesn't calibrate, if I do an external window, now you're going to see we definitely have a sizing difference. So we now have our standalone contact opened up with its own sizing settings, not managed by FL Studio as its own Windows program. Problem. When doing this, because it's its own program and it's an audio program, this will steal your audio driver's focus. If your audio driver can't handle multiple channels at once, whenever this window's open, say bye-bye to FL Studio playing noise, it's only going to play what's going on in contact, or it's going to act super problematic. So in order to counteract that, you can go audio settings and make sure that auto close right here is off. Auto close being on is going to allow, whenever FL Studio is not in focus, it's going to allow whatever is in focus to take control of the audio driver. When auto close is off, it will not free the audio device for anything. FL Studio says it's mine, I'm not letting go of it. And that's what you want. You don't want FL Studio to let go of it when you're using bridged plugins. Next, we have ensure processor state and callbacks. I honestly have no idea what this does, and they do not explain it in the user manual. The user manual pretty much just says, hey, don't touch this unless you're having plugin issues. Specifically, I think it said DC offset. I want to say CPU spikes or volume spikes or something like that. It even says it in the top left. If we look at the left up here, please leave on unless you have issues with the plugin. So leave this on unless you have issues with the plugin. Connections. This is freaking sick. So MIDI has inputs and outputs. Audio has input and outputs. This is the way you would route that for different plugins. This 1 and 1, 2 and 2, 3 and 3, left and right, these all correlate to different inputs and outputs in here. I haven't really done it with Contact. Contact, last time I tried, was being kind of a struggle. But this is really cool for like battery. If you have battery, you can do every kick and every clap and everything to its own mixer channel. It's freaking sick. So if I put this to 6 and I put this to 1, for example, then this would actually be 7. 2 would actually be 8. 3 would actually be 9. And when I'm saying that, I mean mixer channels. I set it to 7, and then whatever's set to those outputs would go after the mixer track that it is set to. 6. So everything would go after the sixth mixer track. You can also tell it to go the other way. See how there's negatives? So if that's mixer track 6, this is mixer track 5, this would be 4, 3, so on and so forth. So if you're doing multiple instruments, you can send out to multiple mixer tracks. Well, how does this work in the mixer plugins? If I open up the F6, for example, from Waves and go to the Processing tab, you'll see we have a second input, for example. And this second input, if I was to put 6 to send information to 8, for example, mixer 6 would, let's say, be our kick. 8 would be our bass. And we wanted to do side chaining. I can come in here, turn that on, and I could take information from the kick, turn it to 1. I'd, of course, have this turned down here because I don't want the actual audio going. But now, if I wanted, I could click External Sound Source. And this external sound source is going to measure our threshold and our range, or how much we increase or decrease volume, compress or expand volume according to the audio source coming in. So I could tell this to turn down at about, 69 hertz whenever the kick comes in, and scoot this bass out of the way if that's what this was. Anything that has a sidechain option, you're almost always going to see an input option here in the back. Now, while I haven't really seen it, I assume that some plugins are going to have multiple outputs. If that ends up being the case, then that's really cool because you could send it off to a sidechain or something like that, much like our Fruity Send here. And then it would send information pre-mute button, which means even with this muted, we could get information in a parallel track, so we could listen to the track alone. If you don't get what I'm saying, I'll set this to insert 9. We'll play the sound. And we got it over here to work in parallel with the original track. If you try doing this the old-fashioned way, by running the parallel like this, as soon as you mute it, you've got no more parallel. Fruity Send, you guys. Extra pro tip that has nothing to do with this video. Coming back in here, we got our troubleshooting section. Reset plugin when FL Studio resets. So from what I understand, this has to do with your play and stop. Every time that the transport controls, end up being done or end up starting, it resets the plugin to whatever state it's supposed to reset to. Again, for troubleshooting, you would use this if every time you click play or stop, a plugin wasn't acting correctly. Maybe an LFO isn't re-triggering like it's supposed to. Whatever your potential issue is, check it, see if it fixes it. Next, we have send loop position. So from my understanding, if I was to make a loop like this, it would send the position information to the plugin. It, however, won't send any loop position information until it loops over one time. At least that's what the manual says. So if you have something that uses start and end loop points in your VST and it is acting incorrectly, you can try turning that off. Again, it's a troubleshooting section. So we are doing troubleshooting things. Use fixed buffer sizes. So use fixed buffer sizes is going to set a fixed 2 milliseconds of buffer length for the plugin. Buffer length is the amount of time that is given for audio to be processed and played. So when you click the play button, if you turn this on, it's going to add an extra 2 milliseconds between when you click play to when you hear audio, because it wants that 2 seconds to make sure it can process everything and play it back to you without, glitching and messing up. Now, the reason you might turn this on is because with it off, FL Studio uses variable chunks of buffer sizes. Some plugins do not like this variable buffer size thing that FL Studio has going on, and they need a fixed buffer size, in which case you would use fixed buffer size. If you did choose to use a fixed buffer size, we got a drop down here for maximum buffer size or maximum size buffers and maximum buffer size from host. So maximum size buffers is going to use FL Studio's maximum block size, which FL Studio decides what that is. And this is going to be a lot more latency than your fixed buffer size or what your variable buffer size would probably be. Matter of fact, I want to see what it says. Got it. Process maximum buffer size. Let's go back to our mixer, hover over it. Dang, dude. So that changed this plugin from 0 milliseconds of latency. I mean, sure it wasn't 0, but low enough it wasn't listed, to 10.67 milliseconds of latency. That is a good amount of latency. So I definitely don't need that. Now, if we go back in here and we look, we also have use maximum buffer size from host. And what this actually does is this just makes the plugin and FL Studio communicate that maximum block size. There's a few plugins out there that actually can use this information to better synchronize the processing time. So if I turn this on and you look here, we'll still see 10 milliseconds. And if I turn that off, remember we said use fixed buffer size creates 2 milliseconds of latency. Lo and behold, up here in the top left, if you haven't known what I'm talking about, is where we'll see the 2 milliseconds of latency. So that's how that works. Now, next we have use time offset. If your plugin is off time and you're trying to fix that, you can click this to troubleshoot and see if it works. Mostly this is for stuff from older FL Studio versions. So if you have something you're loading from an older FL Studio version, you can click use time offset to help fix that. Generally, plugin delay compensation or PDC and using a fixed buffer size will fix this. But if it doesn't, use time offset is the way to go. And next we have fast idle. If you're having sluggish graphics user interface on a plugin, this can help speed that up. However, it will probably cause higher CPU usage. But again, compatibility, click it if you need to. If you don't, leave it alone. While that is it for the effects plugins, here in our instrument plugins, we have this entire section here, our miscellaneous functions. If you're interested in learning that, go to the video above where I cover all the sampler settings and just go to the miscellaneous functions section where I cover all of this in detail. And yeah, that just about covers it. So that's quite a lot to summarize. Pretty much we have a main settings section for general info, graphics user interface, saving presets, things like that. Then we have a processing section where you're going to have switches and buttons for handling things that are processing related or CPU related. And then we have a troubleshooting section, which is for actually troubleshooting specific issues for your plugins themselves. There is way too much different stuff to summarize it quickly. So just check the timestamps below if there's anything specific you want to know. And I hope that this video was helpful. If you like this video, please like this video. If you have any comments, please comment. I always appreciate a subscribe. It's Warren with Scale Audio, and adios.